Chapter 6. Changes. While everyone was distracted, Lionel had already moved, making it to Conrad and James in a few steps and grabbing the side of the latter's collar himself. Another person might have chosen to fight off Conrad first, but Lionel was well aware how foolish such a choice was. No matter what just happened, securing James's safety came first. No matter what happened between them, James was still his best friend. And luckily, he had the now darkened lights on his side. As expected, Conrad wasn't able to react. Seeing that Lionel now had a firm grip on James himself, he could only let go, allowing Lionel to pull James up. Leah? James's words slurred. It was only now that Lionel realized James had actually been unconscious. It was likely his head that had smashed the window apart. It wouldn't be surprising if he was diagnosed with a concussion. Coupling that with the fact he was drunk, and it was a recipe for disaster. Man, you're late, my sister-in-law was waiting on you. Lionel sucked in a cold breath through his teeth when James heavily leaned on him. He was really in no shape to be taking on such a burden, but he still carried him out, letting him sit on the couch. Chef, do you have any gas burners back there? We need some light. Lionel called out. The 4-star chef, who had not said a word even when James' life was on the line, finally looked a bit shaken. He didn't seem to know what was going on. Yes, we use a blowtorch for the finishing touches of certain dishes. He absent-mindedly fumbled through the dark, pulling out the drawer of a hidden compartment to take the torch he was speaking of. But before he could think to hand it to Lionel, it happened. In that few minutes, it felt that the planet would collapse. A cacophony of booms so loud Lionel had no choice but to cover his ears sounded. The earth beneath their feet trembled fiercer, the building swaying wildly from left to right. It was then that Lionel froze. He didn't need to think to know what was causing this. The Paradise Islands. Daddy. A bout of worry seized Lionel's chest. No Paradise Islands were allowed to have routes that crossed over important landmarks. The top 10 academies, government buildings, and historical landmarks all fit this description. So, they were safe, for better or worse. However, Lionel didn't care about his own safety. He was worried about his father. Higher-class Paradise Islands, like the ones him and his father lived on, had several safety features, in case an event just like this one happened. However, they weren't perfect by any stretch of the imagination. This was especially so considering the scope of this power outage. The only slight hope was that Lionel and his father lived on a Paradise Island very close to the surface. The closest they could get, in fact. If their island crashed into some of the high-rise skyscrapers first, it could slow its descent enough to save his father's life. These skyscrapers were exactly the very last line of defense for these disasters. They were built with this potential cataclysm in mind. In the end, Lionel could only force his worry down. If it was a normal power outage caused by some sort of system-wide failure, he would immediately run out of here, even leaving Ina behind. However, before everything happened, their wristwatches had warned of a Class 9 code red. It was very obvious that there was nothing normal about this event. Setting his jaw, Lionel weathered the shaking earth with his hands firmly clasped over his ears. It was lucky that their buildings were built with the highest earthquake technology, or there was no way it would have lasted this long. The atmosphere became gloomy. Students who could go here didn't think often of the Paradise Islands above their heads. They would occasionally obscure the sun, but no more invasively than the clouds do. However, this time, with each crashing boom, they became more and more aware that each represented the deaths of countless innocent people. Completely unprovoked, several began to heave and vomit. A putrid smell filled the 4th-floor lobby along with mute sobs almost completely obscured by the vicious torrent of sounds. Whatever catastrophe the Ascension Empire warned of had yet to even begin, yet billions had already died. What kind of sick joke was this? A few who managed to keep their bearings looked toward Lionel with unconcealed pity. Even though he had closed his eyes and clenched his jaw, keeping his visage expressionless as he covered his ears, they knew well what he must be feeling. Some of them were in the same boat. Even if their families were affluent enough to have a home on the surface, not all of them were able to have a home in those protected zones. Their families might very well die by being crushed by those falling Paradise Islands. Over 10 minutes later, the booms finally stopped, the earth still swaying beneath their feet. Maybe it was only now that they had become aware of just how many of those islands hovered above their heads. of just how many lives they hadn't even cared for to now. When they did, Lionel began to work as though nothing had happened. He carefully took James' shirt off, being mindful to support his head. As expected, not only did James have a concussion, but the remnant shards of glass on the bottom ledge of the windowsill had left deep gashes to his lower back. Accepting the blowtorch from the 4-star chef, Lionel borrowed a few scented candles from a resident of the dorm and lit them, finally giving them a semblance of light. Lionel wasn't a medic, but he had taken a few first aid classes. He was unsure if the medics they had on standby for the game were still here, or if they had left to their homes. After all, it had been over an hour, approaching 2, since the game ended. He didn't have the luxury of looking for them. Cleaning out James' wounds to his lower back as best he could, he slowly removed pieces of glass stuck in his flesh. Finally, he wrapped them after disinfecting with some cooking wine he got from the chef. "Love you, man." James's drunk voice faded, only to be replaced by his light snoring soon after. Those here couldn't help but think he was the luckiest one of them all. Even if they tried to sleep now, they had no doubt that they'd fail. Lionel smiled and shook his head, his gaze turning empty for a moment. What should he do now? In truth, he knew that the best answer was to stay put. Everyone else knew as well. As one of the protected zones, they could obviously be among the first to receive government assistance. But what was this code red? Was it just a worldwide power outage? Lionel had a feeling that it was more, but he had to admit to himself that he had no real evidence for this being the case. It was just that. How could the mighty Ascension Empire, which unified Earth, not be ready for such a thing? It made Lionel think that there was something that caused this outage actively. It wasn't a mistake, but rather an event even their empire had no means of stopping. The good news is that we have room and board. The Academy also stockpiles several years' worth of food in an abundance of caution, thanks to previous rebellion and hostage situations. The bad is that the campus is current above its usual carrying capacity, due to the game and the afterpart. Also, without power, the large freezers will slowly lose their heat. It'll be even faster if people are constantly opening and closing their doors. It would be possible to take preemptive action and cure what we can. But not many will listen to my words. They'll believe I'm being overly paranoid. The food here is enough to last a month easily before they start to go bad. No one would think that the Empire would be unable to recover in that time, so they wouldn't be willing to make sacrifices. Nani? Lionel's thoughts spun quickly. A part of him wanted to act frugally out of caution, but another part understood that unless people had evidence toward how dangerous this situation was, they wouldn't listen. This was simply the way human beings were. In truth, Lionel didn't want to deal with any of this. He only wanted to go and see if his father was all right. He didn't care about anything else. Damn, I can't stand this smell. Conrad's high-bridged nose wrinkled. As soon as the swaying of the building normalized, he didn't want to stand there a second longer. Usually such a mess of vomit would be cleaned easily with their high-tech. But this was obviously impossible now. It wasn't even a guarantee that they still had running water. Lionel didn't stop Conrad from walking away, and why would he? Unfortunately, it seemed that Conrad wasn't destined to get very far. The building quaked once more. For a moment, Lionel thought that the foundation was too shaken by the previous earthquakes and that the dormitory was collapsing. But in the next instant, he saw something he would never forget in his life. It was a spatial tear. Lionel was absolutely certain. He had never seen one, nor had he ever read the description of one, but he had a vivid enough imagination to know that if there ever was a spatial tear, it would look exactly like this. Maybe the only thing that deviated from his fanciful image was the fact it lit up the night sky as though it was day. Other than that, everything else was the same. The abrupt cognitive dissonance, its black, starry innards, the way it seemed to have no, and simultaneously endless, depth. Lionel's expression changed as it watched it through the shattered window. It's expanding. We can't stay here. Milan? Lionel reacted quickly. Understanding what he meant, Lionel's big offensive lineman strung James over his shoulder. Lionel would have done it himself, but his ribs were in no state to be taking on such a load. However, just as they were about to run out of the building, Conrad's voice caused Lionel to pause his steps. What the hell are you doing? Do you know who I am? Get the hell off of me. Lionel was taken aback. The very same young girl who had vomited during the fall of the Paradise Islands stood in the way of the closest exit, her gaze vacant. No, that wasn't accurate enough. Her irises had completely turned white, even her pupils followed suit. Her expression was cold. Lionel instinctually felt that it was impossible for the same girl who vomited just at the thought of dead bodies to display such a visage. Just what was happening? Her small frame suddenly took a step forward, her palm slamming into Conrad's chest. By all rights, nothing should have happened. Conrad stood an inch taller than even Lionel, and spent every day of his life training as all their athletes did. In addition, he hadn't been injured in the game like Lionel had. At the same time, the small girl was just a junior, dragged to this party by one of her seniors, and was barely 5'4". Yet, it seemed the illogical was the theme of this day. With a dull grunt, Conrad was pushed back hard enough for him to fall to his back, a stunned expression on his face. "You." A mixture of embarrassment and anger reddened Conrad's face. To make matters worse, he had slipped and fallen right beside the pool of vomit, causing him to inwardly retch. "Hey, Demi." Lionel's head spun in another direction, only to see yet another student with a gaze as vacant as the small girl's. In a moment, one became two. Then two became three. In a flash, 10 pairs of white irises shimmered under the blue light of the spatial rift, dully gazing toward them all. Among them there was even one of his own teammates. Lionel's expression turned serious. "Aina, Yuri, Savan, come here." This time the abrasive Savan had not a single word to say. The nervousness in her expression was clear as she slowly entered Lionel's circle of protection along with Aina and Yuri. A spatial tear grew to their backs, their white-pupiled peers blocked their fronts, and an inexplicable feeling of uncertainty and fear pervaded their hearts. Chapter 7. Spatial Tear. Though Lionel's heart was assaulted with a whirlwind of confusion, it didn't show to his face. 10 of them. Not overly dangerous but definitely uncontrollable variables. The chef is most definitely the greatest hazard. Unfortunately, the 4-star chef was among these white-pupiled individuals. Though he had yet to move from behind his curved bar, Lionel didn't need much of an imagination to think of just how many sharp kitchen knives must be back there. A few of the angel wings helped Conrad up, the tense atmosphere steadily growing. The white-pupiled individuals didn't move, and neither did they. Lionel would have thought that they were observing them had it not been for the fact their eyes were too vacant. It didn't seem like any thoughts were going through their heads. But if that was the case, then they should be acting on instinct. So, just what was this instinct? They don't want us to leave this room? The steadily growing spatial rift to their back waned and growled. Lionel's eyes widened. He realized in an instant that this sound wasn't from the tier, but rather the groaning of the building as it was being slowly sucked inward. Damn it. However, even as everyone began to panic, Lionel grew calmer. His rational mind told him that there was a logical progression to all of this. There was a design to it. First, their electricity goes out. Second came the spatial tear. Then there came these odd mutations to their peers and acquaintances, and now they were being pushed toward this spatial tear. If the goal was to kill them, why wouldn't these white-pupiled individuals directly attack them? They even had the backing of the 4-star chef. However, they chose not to do this. Just when Lionel was going to resolve him to hop into the spatial tear, a shard of glass flew from the windowsill James had just hung from. It collided with the spatial tear, ripping into pieces with a chilling noise. No matter how steely Lionel considered himself, he couldn't help but shudder. Is that what would happen to his body if he entered? Damn it. He thought to himself a second time in just as many seconds. We have to make it past. Lionel knew that James was right about him. He was too soft-hearted. He had actually almost made such a reckless decision because he would rather risk himself on a gamble than fight his classmates. But he realized now he couldn't do this. He had to steal his heart. Focus on the known commodity. Come on, you. Lionel's jaw set. Let's go. Without another ounce of hesitation, Lionel took a strong step forward, heading toward the petite girl. Crossing by Conrad and his teammates, he appeared before the girl more than a head shorter than him. Gritting his teeth and ignoring the pain, he quickly pulled his long black coat off. Holding onto its shoulders, he whipped its buckled ends toward the girl's head. He didn't know how intelligent these white-pupiled people were, but he emphasized his speed and cunning. At the very least, his first gamble paid off. The others weren't quick enough to react to his sudden movement. Savon covered her lips in a gasp, wanting to call out to Lionel and stop him. But it was already too late. The little girl's dull eyes didn't seem surprised at Lionel's action. Or maybe it was just that she wouldn't be surprised about anything in her current state. Without much thought, she reached forward in a lightning-quick motion to grab the ends of Lionel's coat before he could react. But it seemed Lionel had been expecting this. Following the curved path he flung his coat forward with, he wrapped around the girl's back. He used her own grip against her, pulling the coat across her back and around. In a flash, the frail girl had her arms tied down by Lionel's coat and his arms. "Let's go!" As Lionel spoke, the other white-pupiled individuals began to move. However, Lionel had already thought this would happen. Pulling the knot he'd tied with his coat around the girl tight, he pushed her forward into her own pool of vomit. As expected, she regained her balance quickly with inhuman reflexes, only to slip when her soles touched the pool. Without being able to recover again, she fumbled and fell amidst Conrad's group, slowing their forward momentum. Conrad's group had been the closest to the exit. It was no doubt that they would take advantage of Lionel's actions first. For men who had almost been complicit in his best friend's death, he wouldn't be soft on them. As for the white-pupiled mutants, Lionel could only push his guilt down. He subconsciously felt that it wasn't their fault, but if he made concessions for them, he would be putting the life of him and his friends in danger. By the time these things happened, the members of the Royal Blue, the partygoers, and Aina, plus her friends, had made it to Lionel's side, pushing through to the exit. Lionel signaled Milan, who still had James over his shoulder with his eyes. The big guy reacted immediately, kicking the couch James had been laying on over and creating another barrier. "Lionel!" Conrad's enraged roar tore through the commotion, his gaze reddening with rage. Unfortunately for him, Lionel had already turned away, causing Conrad's heart to go cold. He suddenly regretted his previous actions. However, what he regretted wasn't the fact he threatened James's life, but rather that he hadn't taken control of the white-pupiled girl before Lionel got to her. He had been the closest initially. Why was he always lagging one step behind him? Lionel didn't have time to worry about Conrad's thoughts. The white-pupiled individuals were just an afterthought. What really shook him to his core was the spatial tear. He hadn't felt that death was this close since the first time he skydived from his paradise island. But Lionel had made a mistake. In all his calculations, he had forgotten one important fact. They were on the 4th floor. Damn it. They're everywhere. Xavier, a 3-star safety of the Royal Blues, shouted from the staircase. His words were like the whisper of the Grim Reaper to Lionel's ears. Lionel hadn't taken into account that if such odd occurrences were happening on his floor, how could they not be occurring on others? Rushing into the stairway and slamming the door shut behind him, Lionel looked forward with a grim expression. The problem was worse than he had first believed. On the stairway, 3 pairs of white pupils were waiting. The lights were far dimmer here due to a lack of windows and the fact the power was still out, so they almost looked like floating orbs in the night, sending a shiver down Lionel's spine. Milan stood to Lionel's right, his back against the door just like him. Before them, the 3 girls were already halfway down the flight of stairs, while Xavier and a few others were ahead of them and steadily backing away from the 3 mutants. Lionel bit his lip, almost drawing blood. It was one thing to put some bruises and broken bones on the line on the football field, but it was another thing entirely to have death looming over his head like this. He still didn't know if his father was alive. He still hadn't shed the stigma of his profession. He still hadn't heard Aina's answer. Lionel's gaze shifted to her back. Even in the dim light, she had an alluring charm. Her figure held a steady maturity to it. Aina had always been like this. She was shy in the face of his naked adoration, but she was the only one who seemed capable of continuing to write her exams under his presence. The leaning of the building grew fiercer. By now, Lionel knew it was already too late. A banging on the door came from behind him. With each passing moment, it grew fiercer before it suddenly stopped entirely. Lionel sighed. Conrad and his group had probably been sucked in first, due to the open window. There were no large windows in the stairway, nor were any of them broken open, but it was still only a matter of time. He faintly hoped that in their last moments, even if he couldn't see his father, that Aina might say the words that could put a smile on his face even now. But her small frame seemed to have no intention of turning. Maybe I was wrong. I guess she doesn't like me. These were Lionel's last thoughts before the building gave way, snapping off from its foundation and flying into the spatial tier. There was yet another thing Lionel was wrong about, though. The spatial rift didn't take everything. The moment those with white pupils touched its surface, they were safely rebounded away. The grotesque sounded of shearing metal, brick, and foundation sounded through the air. In an odd way, it almost sounded like chewing, as though the spatial tier was having a good meal as it smacked its lips. All around Earth, similar events occurred. Many shared the same thoughts of agony and despair Lionel had. Many more had suffered terrible acts of revenge, guilt, and sometimes even both in just those spare few minutes. The world was changing in a completely unprecedented way. There were some who managed to escape the tears, but it was impossible to tell if their situations were any better. In a world filled with white-eyed mutants, normal humans had suddenly become the minority. The odd mutations continued, even transcending the human race and affecting the other animal kingdoms. However, even as their population grew, they did nothing. They stood silently, their pale eyes gazing vacantly toward empty space. Even those who stood just a few steps from another of their kind didn't speak, as though they were all collectively waiting for something. The so-called government response never came. Ascension Empire's Paradise Palace stood majestically, spanning hundreds of meters to the left and right, but it too was silent. Only the slight whipping of its high-masted flag, moving with the wind, could be heard for several kilometers. If one wanted to speak of the death of a world, it seemed that such a description could be any better. However, the world hadn't ended. Not just yet, anyway. Lionel and his group lay unconscious on a bed of eroded limestone. Around them, half-broken pillars stood, etched with ancient runes impossible to decipher. An odd energy swirled around them. At first glance, it seemed to be much more like fog than anything else. However, it behaved completely unlike fog. Instead, it moved and almost breathed like a living entity. Over half of this fog surged toward a delicate, sleeping beauty. Compared to the disheveled appearances of the others, she looked as though she was doing nothing more than taking a sweet nap. Her visage made many want to scramble to protect her, the light smile on her pink lips causing a twitch in the hearts of those lucky enough to see it. A fifth surged toward a young man with long blonde hair and a high-bridged nose. Even in his sleep, he scowled fiercely as though facing an enemy. The disdain was almost painted onto his lofty cheekbones. Another fifth descended toward a tall young man with bandages wrapped around his torso. He snored loudly, rubbing his stomach without a care in the world as he turned over. The remaining portions spread out evenly, seeping into the bodies of the remaining unconscious youths completely unbeknownst to them. The hours continued to tick by, and eventually it became days. However, they all kept a comfortable smile on their faces as though it was a soft cloud and not hard rock they slept upon. Finally, on the fourth day, the first of them began to stir.